assumes they have the intelligence to get on a call-in program and defile the President of the United States for something he's not responsible for is beyond my
We're going to go now to the House of Representatives, gaveling in for morning hour.
The House will be in order. The Chair lays before the House a communication from the Speaker.
The Speaker's Rooms, Washington, D.C., October 23, 2013. I hereby appoint the Honorable Chris Stewart to act as Speaker pro tempore on this day. Signed, John A. Boehner, Speaker of the House of Representatives.
Pursuant to the order of the House of January 3, 2013, the Chair now recognizes members from lists submitted by the majority and minority leaders for morning hour debate. The Chair will alternate recognition between the parties, with each party limited to 1 hour, and each member, other than the majority and minority leaders and minority whip, limited to 5 minutes each, but in no event shall debate continue beyond 11:50 a.m. The Chair recognizes the gentleman from North Carolina, Mr. Jones, for 5 minutes.
Mr. Speaker, I am on the floor today in remembrance of the bombing of the United States Marine Corps barracks in Beirut, Lebanon, 30 years ago. In October 23, 1983, at approximately 6:20 a.m. in the morning, a truck packed with explosives broke security and detonated outside of the barracks, killing 241 Americans and wounding 128 more. Mr. Speaker, I believe it is appropriate that on the 30th anniversary of this act of terrorism, we recognize the sacrifice of the individuals who lost life and limb and joined with their families and friends of the victims in mourning for their loss. Furthermore, I believe that we should learn from the example of America's leader at the time of the bombing, President Ronald Reagan. President Reagan appreciated the sacrifice made by our service members and was deeply pained by the loss of life. While many other presidents would have continued sacrificing young men and women for the sake of the mission in Lebanon, President Reagan acknowledged his mistake. I would like to take a moment to read a statement he made regarding the bombing. Quote, "Perhaps we didn't appreciate fully enough the depth of the hatred and the complexity of the problems that made the Middle East such a jungle. Perhaps the idea of a suicide car bomber committing mass murder to gain instant entry to paradise was so foreign to our own values and consciousness that it did not create in us the concern for the Marine safety that it should have. In the weeks immediately after the bombing, I believe the last thing we should do was to turn tail and leave. Yet the irrationality of Middle East politics forced us to rethink our policy. If there would be some rethinking of policy before our men die, we would be a lot better off. If that policy had changed toward more of a neutral position and neutrality, those 241 Marines would be alive today. I have read these quotes from President Reagan to honor the sacrifice of the 241 Marines and their families. They did not die in vain, but gave their lives to bring peace to a troubled area. The leaders of our country must learn from tragedies like Beirut that our men and women in uniform are very precious. Our foreign policy must be formed with a better understanding of the commitment and purpose in a mission before we risk the life of one single American. I believe sincerely that this was the point President Reagan was making as he remarked with remorse on the bombing of the Marine barracks in Beirut, Lebanon on October the 23rd of 1983. Mr. Speaker, I have the privilege to represent Camp Lejeune Marine Base and other bases in eastern North Carolina. And I have visited the Beirut Memorial many times to look at the names, certainly people I never knew and probably would not have known. But the point is that our foreign policy continues today in Afghanistan. We have had 6 Americans killed in the last week. In the bill that passed recently to raise the debt ceiling, there was $30 billion for Karzai, who is a crook. And I do not understand this Congress. I do not understand this Congress why we continue to sacrifice our young men and women and why we continue to send money that we do not have to a foreign dictator, and we cut programs for children and seniors who won't have a meal. With that, Mr. Speaker, I honor the 241 who died by closing by saying, I ask God to please bless our men and women in uniform, to please bless the families of our men and women in uniform, and dear God, I ask you to continue to bless America. I yield back the balance of my time.
The gentleman yields. The chair recognizes the gentleman from Illinois, Mr. Gutierrez, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I don't think it is news to my friends on the Republican side of the aisle that you don't win every battle around here. The place is tough and occasionally you get knocked down. The measure of a man or a woman in Congress, or any place for that matter, is what you do after. We all witnessed a political showdown over the past several weeks, and now it is time to put it behind us. The challenge, my colleagues on both sides of the aisle, to step up and show the country what you're made of. And let us actually legislate on behalf of the American people. I've heard a lot of my colleagues on the other side of the aisle say things like, we don't trust that president. We can't work with this president. So, Mr. Speaker, does this apply to everything? Will there be no legislation until there's a different president in 2017? Well, that doesn't sound very realistic. On my side of the aisle, they're already saying, oh, those Republicans, they're hardliners. They will not compromise on anything. And when someone does reach across the aisle to say, hey, let's work on an issue together, what do we get? Hey, why are you helping them? I've heard it when I stood with David Valadao in California, or Paul Ryan in Chicago, to say immigration reform is an objective we can reach in a bipartisan manner. I heard from the Democrats, stop working with them. We're trying to defeat them. We want to take the House back. Look, I get it. There are millions of dollars to be raised by partisan bickering. Your side raised a ton of money off the past battle, and my side has too. The fact is that if two of us get into a shouting match, it is news. And if it gets bad, it will be shown on every channel. But if two of us reach an agreement on something, it's not news. You know, bipartisanship is something that is much lauded here, but it is infrequently applauded and rarely rewarded. But here's the thing. The only way we actually get anything done is to put aside the shouting matches and work together. I want immigration reform to pass. And even though I think almost every single Democrat agree with me, it's still not enough because there's only 201 of us. We don't run the Rules Committee or set the agenda. Republicans are the majority in the House. So I know I have to work with the other side. On your side, you say you don't like what the Senate passed. Let's not just respond with nothing. Let's craft a House response and put our own proposal on the table. Those on the other side of the aisle say they don't trust the president and can't work with him. Well, okay, fine. Then work with your colleagues on this side of the aisle. You know, there are 435 of us. We need 218 votes to pass a bill, and the president doesn't get a vote. The truth is that even during the shutdown, many of your side of the aisle have been drafting proposals that many of us on this side of the aisle are willing to work with you on. The question is whether the work on a bipartisan basis will be allowed to flourish. I want to spend the rest of this Congress working with whoever wants to join in either party to get immigration reform done. Your side needs a little time to recover from the last fight. I get that. But with 1,100 deportations every day, we can't wait forever. The kids who are losing their moms are not going to wait for you or for me. The husbands and the fathers who die in the desert because their wives and kids live here don't have any more time to give. But you probably ask, Louise, after the battle over health care and budget, how can two parties ever work together? But you know, that's exactly what I thought in 1996. How can we work together? I was here 17 years ago. In 1996, it was Speaker Gingrich who shut down the government. But after that, let's remember what happened. We passed a series of major bipartisan bills on difficult policy issues. Welfare reform was crafted in part by a very conservative House and signed by a very liberal President, Clinton. He had vetoed the bill twice before, but after the shutdown, reached an agreement with the Republican majority. The Kennedy-Kassenbaum bill was historic bipartisan legislation on health care, and we passed it after the shutdown. We can do the same if politicians in both parties are committed to accomplishment over campaign talking points. We can pass immigration reform this year. We all know that immigration reform is immensely popular with voters in both parties who want a political solution to fixing our broken immigration system. Diverse constituencies, immigration reform like labor unions and business owners and evangelical leaders and Catholic bishops and leaders across the political spectrum. Don't think of it as working with President Obama if it makes it easier for you. Think of it as doing your job. Think of it as working on behalf of the American people. Not for an Obama solution, not for a Tea Party solution, but for an American solution.
The gentleman yields back. The chair recognizes the gentleman from North Carolina, Mr. COBLE, for 5 minutes.
I thank the Speaker. Mr. Speaker, if you missed this past Sunday morning TV talking head shows, you missed the political double standard at work. Time and again, the host of the aforesaid programs referred to the recent, quote, Republican government shutdown. Wait a minute. Republican government shutdown? There were two advocacy groups to this affair. One, President Obama and the Democratic administration, and two, the Republicans. So it appears to me, Mr. Speaker, that a more accurate description would be the Republicans, President Obama, and the Democrat administration and the government shutdown. The Republicans, in spite of the President's adamant refusal to negotiate, requested a one-year delay for the controversial health care proposal. The President rejected that proposal, but considering the reviews surrounding his health care proposal, which are at best dismal, it was an offer the President should have embraced. All of us, in and out of the political arena, should dismiss the application of the double standard that oftentimes is used in this town. And we should encourage objectivity to prevail over subjectivity, and in so doing our country will become the beneficiary of good government, of fair government, and good government finally will be promoted in the end, and we will all benefit therefrom. I thank the Speaker and I yield back the balance of my time.
The gentleman yields back. The chair recognizes the gentleman from Oregon, Mr. Blumenauer, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Today the House begins consideration of the Water Resources Reform and Development Act, which includes in the title the word reform, but would represent a huge step backwards. This legislation would have significant impact on the way the Army Corps of Engineers conducts projects that are critical to the nation's environmental and economic health. I've long worked to help the Corps be a better partner, in which times this has proved troublesome. It was my pleasure to work with the head of the Corps previously, General Robert Flowers, and his staff to change the way the Corps does business. Otherwise, we can waste a lot of money and inflict unnecessary environmental damage. One of the ways the Corps meets its environmental responsibilities is by compliance with the National Environmental Policy Act, NEPA, signed into act on New Year's Day in 1970 by President Richard Nixon. Earlier this year, Glenn Bowman, an official with the Georgia Department of Transportation, shared with Georgia legislators President Nixon's observation that clean air, clean water, open space should be the birthright of every American. Through our years of past carelessness, we've incurred a debt to nature that is now being called. Mr. Bowman told the legislators that 43 years later, the price tag is even higher, some problems remain, and daunting challenges loom, but that NEPA's impact is unquestionable. It remains the nation's guiding environmental star. He observes that environmental needs and protecting the environment are not mutually exclusive, and it is important to work together to achieve those objectives. Sadly, for me, the most critical element in a bill that I would like to support is damage to the NEPA process. Placing an artificial time limit of 150 days, restricting the internal activity of the agencies, giving them limited time to move the process along, interfering with the chain of command, cutting out the public from the process, and forcing shorter time for litigation is unnecessary. It's ill-advised, and it's not going to solve the problem. Project delays are not the result of the NEPA process. There are billions of dollars of projects that are already approved and ready to go, $60 billion by some estimates. The problem is that Congress has not adequately funded the Corps. I'll be offering an amendment with Congressman DeFazio that simply suspends this ill-advised amendment to NEPA, seriously compromising it and the public process until the project backlog disappears. Move forward with already approved projects. Ironically, this bill would add to the backlog while it truncates the NEPA process. NEPA protects community values. It can often result in alternatives that are even less costly as well as less damaging to the environment. Before we rush to implement ill-advised changes under the guise of reform, let's get rid of the backlog first, already approved projects, and be able to work through the consequences. Forcing more projects that will be ill-considered will make them less worthy of funding for agencies that are chronically underfunded and facing further budget cuts. Imposing artificial time limits on an already overwhelming backlog is not a prescription for more development projects being completed, better performance. It's a prescription for sloppy work, ill-advised approvals, more litigation when we should be concentrating on getting the job done. It will make it harder to serve the public and get the financial support to build vital projects. I urge my colleagues to support the DeFazio-Blumenauer amendment to reduce the backlog of projects ready to go before complicating and weakening environmental protections and the public's right to participate. I would request unanimous consent to enter into the record comments of Mr. Glenn Bowman from the Georgia Department of Transportation.
Without objection. The gentleman yields back. The chair recognizes the gentleman from North Carolina, Mr. Holding, for 5 minutes.
Mr. Speaker, in just a few short months, we will again find ourselves debating how to not shut down the federal government. Our nation's fiscal woes are not temporary. In fact, they have plagued us for many years. And we've got to stop trying to solve these problems with temporary solutions. The fact is, Mr. Speaker, we are now $17 trillion in debt, and our government continues to spend and spend and spend. Last Thursday, our nation's debt jumped $328 billion in just one day. This surpassed the previous high set 2 years ago by over $100 billion. It's time Congress breaks this pattern. We do not want to be a nation drowning in debt, but rather one of economic leadership throughout the world with pro-growth policies. Mr. Speaker, we simply cannot borrow 40 cents of every dollar we spend. It's simply not a way to run a government, a business, or family budget. Yet the federal government continues to borrow without addressing what got us here in the first place, which is out-of-control spending. Mr. Speaker, the deal agreed to last week didn't do a single thing to cut spending or tackle the real drivers of our debt. And if we do not change this, we will never get ourselves out of the fiscal rut, but instead find ourselves repeating history over and over and over again, governing and spending by continuing resolutions. Rather than passing temporary spending bills and short-term extensions of the debt ceiling, we should be working to pass all 12 appropriation bills and a real budget. This doesn't need to be a deal at the 11th hour. If we go through a regular budgetary process, we will most certainly find areas to eliminate wasteful spending, shore up entitlement spending, and achieve comprehensive tax reform. Mr. Speaker, the federal government is already spending too much, and Obamacare will only make things worse. It is estimated that Obamacare will increase taxes over $1 trillion and add $6 trillion to the deficit. Putting aside the countless policy issues associated with Obamacare, the law, from a purely numerical economic standpoint, is a prime example of out-of-control spending. Overall, Obamacare is expected to increase health care spending by $621 billion over the next 10 years. We cannot afford this. Our children cannot afford this, and the economy will crumble underneath it. Mr. Speaker, the American people are frustrated with seeing their elected officials in Washington sit on either side of the wall and refuse to make a real spending cuts. It's time to sit down and have a conversation about how we get our fiscal house in order and get our spending addiction under control. We cannot continue to jeopardize our economy and our nation's future with spending more than we take in. Mr. Speaker, I yield back.
The gentleman yields back. The chair recognizes the gentleman from Michigan, Mr. KILDEE, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And while typically I would address the House on much more serious subjects, today it's a slightly lighter subject that I'm here to address. Much to my regret, I'm here, Mr. Speaker, and standing before you to congratulate my dear friend and classmate from Massachusetts, Mr. Kennedy, and his Boston Red Sox on their American League Championship Series win over my beloved Detroit Tigers. In accord with our gentleman's agreement, today I am wearing the gentleman's rather unsightly Boston Red Sox tie, which is painful to say the least. Although the Tigers did not make it to the World Series this year, I do want to say how proud I am of our players, of our team, of our state, and seriously and specifically of Jim Leyland, who after 2 World Series, 4 American League Championship Series, 8 years as our manager, announced his retirement this week. Jim, I am sure I speak for all Michiganders and all baseball fans in saying that we are proud to have you retire as a Detroit Tiger. To Michigan and specifically to Detroit, the Tigers have always meant more than just baseball. Year after year, their perseverance and grit through really tough times for both the team and for the city, that perseverance has been emblematic of the determination and resilience of Detroiters and Michiganders. Tiger baseball has provided hope and instilled a sense of pride in the city and in the state that has surely seen its share of difficulties. Their performance and their wins have not certainly erased the challenges that we face, but it's given the community and our state a lift. Like the team, Detroit and Michigan has always had hope for the next season. I love my Detroit Tigers and appreciate all they mean to the great state of Michigan, and to Jim Leyland and our amazing team. Bless you, boys. So today, regrettably but sincerely, I salute my colleague from Massachusetts and his winning team, the Boston Red Sox. I had hoped for a different outcome, but nonetheless, a win is a win. Joe, congratulations to you and to the Red Sox. I yield back.
The gentleman yields back. Members are reminded to direct their comments towards the chair and not to a perceived viewing audience. The chair now recognizes the gentleman from California, Mr. McClintock, for 5 minutes.
Mr. Speaker, this nation has gone through 18 government shutdowns in the last 37 years. 15 of those 18 shutdowns occurred when Democrats controlled the House. In those 15 shutdowns, the Democrats demanded increased abortion services and labor and environmental policy concessions. Now, perhaps the reason we don't remember those shutdowns as vividly is because in those days, presidents negotiated around the clock to resolve the disputes that caused them and did everything that they could to minimize the public's inconvenience and suffering. This time was different. This time, the president refused to negotiate, and he took unprecedented steps to amplify the pain and suffering that the public endured. A senior administration official told the Wall Street Journal, quote, "We're winning. It doesn't really matter to us how long the shutdown lasts because what matters is the end result." The park ranger said, "We've been told to make life as difficult as we can for people. It's disgusting." This administration barricaded open-air venues like the World War II Memorial for honor flights by World War II veterans, yet it opened the National Mall for an amnesty rally by illegal immigrants. It closed simple parking lots and roadside turnouts that merely offered passers-by distant views of Mount Rushmore and Yosemite. It ordered businesses to close just because they leased land from the federal government. It even tried to close the ocean to Florida fishermen. These measures had never been taken in prior shutdowns, and they often cost more than simply leaving these venues open. A constituent of mine in Hume, California wrote, quote, "To get to my place of residence and work, I have to travel through the Big Stump entrance station of Kings Canyon National Park on Highway 180. Currently, the entire roadway is barricaded and it appears as though the Park Service is attempting to prevent anyone from traveling to or through the national park. I was in the area 17 years ago as a young adult during the last government shutdown, and this type of thing didn't happen. Sure, the facilities at the visitor centers were closed, but the land was still accessible." Now, why would the administration do this? Why would it deliberately order our public servants to, quote, make life as difficult as possible for people? They told us why. Because they were winning politically. On October 2nd, House Republicans, joined by 23 Democrats, passed H.J. Res. 70 to open the national parks, but the bill was killed in the Senate. Why? Well, they told us why. They were winning politically. When Republican Governor Jan Brewer stepped forward to use state funds to staff the Grand Canyon National Park, as Arizona had done in previous shutdowns, she was stonewalled by the administration for 10 days. Why? Well, they told us why. They were winning politically. Now, what was the outrageous Republican demand the Democrats refused even to discuss during the 16-day shutdown while they ordered our public servants to make life as difficult as possible for people? Well, on September 30th, with the deadline just hours away, House Republicans had dropped all conditions to fund the entire government with one substantive exception: delay the individual mandate that forces people to buy policies against their will. Democrats summarily rejected this proposal and for 16 days refused to negotiate on this single point while literally accusing Republicans of sedition. Then this past Monday, the President's press secretary made this stunning admission: the administration may itself seek to delay the individual mandate by dropping the penalty for noncompliance. They've got to be kidding. For the 16 days of the shutdown, the only substantive dispute was the Republican plea to delay the individual mandate for the millions of Americans who couldn't find or afford Obamacare policies. Doing so would have ended the impasse instantly. During those 16 days, it was clear to everyone that the exchanges weren't working. Yet for 16 days, the President and congressional Democrats refused even to discuss the matter while they turned their formidable propaganda machine to the task of winning politically. Then, just 4 days after Republicans capitulated on all points, including dropping our single substantive request to delay the individual mandate, the administration is now itself considering delaying the individual mandate. Mr. Speaker, these facts speak for themselves and need no embellishment from me. John Adams once observed that facts are stubborn things. As passions cool and reason resumes its rightful place in the nation's discourse, these facts will speak eloquently and stubbornly of what happens when politics trumps policy and propaganda trumps reality. I yield back.
The gentleman yields back. The chair recognizes the gentlewoman from Ohio, Ms. KAPTUR, for 5 minutes.
I ask unanimous consent to address the House for 5 minutes to revise and extend.
Without objection.
The greatest power a banker has is to create money. Banks can also abuse that awesome power. And it seems like the bigger the banks are, the more they abuse that power. A vivid example: it was over 5 years ago that America was hit with the great Wall Street-induced recession. 5 years later, those banks are still paying our people almost nothing if they have deposits or certificates of deposit with those institutions. That's harming seniors across this country. That's harming people who are trying to make a go of it. It's harming investors. Meanwhile, banks continue to post huge profits, especially the very biggest ones that are market controllers. J.P. Morgan Chase, just in the last year, $21 billion in profit. Wells Fargo, $19 billion. Goldman Sachs, $7.5 billion in profit. Citigroup, $7.5 billion. Bank of America, $4 billion. While Americans continue to struggle to make ends meet and recuperate from that great recession. Now, it's been reported this week that J.P. Morgan Chase will agree to a $13 billion settlement of the civil suit filed by the United States Department of Justice and the Federal Housing Finance Agency in order to resolve several investigations into their fraudulent mortgage securities business. One question I have with that $13 billion, are they actually going to pay it? Or are they going to use it as a deduction on their taxes, as a business expense, or some other tax dodge that their accountants and lawyers figure out? Now, from September 7th, 2005 through September 19th, 2007, J.P. Morgan and its affiliates knowingly misrepresented the value and quality of their mortgage bonds that it sold to the Federal Housing Finance Agency. The result of their actions are reverberating still throughout our economy as foreclosure rates in places like Ohio continue to go up. They're still above the national average. In August, foreclosure starts in Ohio were up 44% from the previous month, for a total of, just that month, 9,542 foreclosure filings. Thousands of families, tens of thousands of people affected from coast to coast. Minority neighborhoods were especially harmed by the financial crisis. A report by the Urban Institute estimates the loss of home equity in African American households as a result of the foreclosure crisis at $194 billion. All the wealth that was accumulated since World War II vaporized. Hit very hard. Hispanic communities, they lost $177 billion in home equity during the same time period. Awesome. Although a settlement has been reached in this particular case, this should not be the end of the investigation into Wall Street banks, because J.P. Morgan and their brethren have proven to be repeat offenders. Criminal charges should be pursued, not just civil. This settlement is just one of many recent penalties that J.P. has had to pay. In June 2011, J.P. Morgan had to pay $153 million in penalties to the Securities and Exchange Commission for misleading investors about a collateralized debt obligation. In August 2012, that bank had to pay $1.2 billion for what it had done to conspire with Visa and MasterCard to set the price of credit card and debit interchange fees. In July of this year, J.P. Morgan had to pay $410 million in penalties and repayments to the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission for revealing that the bank had been manipulating the California and Midwest electricity markets from September 2010 to November 2012. And J.P. Morgan Chase had to pay a $100 million fine for reckless conduct and market manipulation in connection with its 2012 London whale trading scandal. Question I have is, can they deduct any of these penalties from the taxes they pay, or are they really paying those penalties to the government of the United States free and clear? In the past 3 years, J.P. Morgan has posted year after year record profits, driven by their stock prices. Last year, the firm made $21.3 billion. Therefore, with this recent settlement, would be about only half of their most recent profits. For a frame of reference, there are only 7 Dow Jones Industrial Average companies that made more than $13 billion profits last year. We can say to ourselves, would these fines, if they were really paid, do any harm to J.P. Morgan? Think about this. They have $87 billion in reserves, and their total assets are valued by their own accounts at over $2.25 trillion. That's a wow, by any account. The result of all of this misbehavior is many Americans have lost all of their accumulated equity. Mr. Speaker, it's time to restore prudent banking. I ask my colleagues to sign on H.R. 129, the Return to Prudent Banking Act of 2013. Let's restore the Glass-Steagall Act and the value of our money. I yield back my remaining time.
The gentlewoman's time has expired. The chair recognizes the gentleman from West Virginia, Mr. McKinley, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. For months, President Obama promised he would initiate long overdue negotiations on issues from health care to tax and regulatory reform, all factors holding back economic growth. But he linked this pledge to Congress reopening the government and raising the debt limit. His promise to address the critical drivers of our economy is why last week I voted to end the budget impasse and tentatively agree to cooperate with the President. With the government reopened, it's time for those promises that he made to be upheld, for negotiations to begin. Our economy is still way too weak. Let's look at the facts. 97% of all the jobs created in America this past year have been part-time. Millions of our workers are seeing their hours cut. Participation at the workforce is at an all-time low for the last 35 years, with 90 million adults sitting on the sidelines. Our neighbors and our friends are struggling and are uncomfortable about our future. Our latest college graduates can't find jobs, and millions more of our country's youth have quit searching for employment. It's time to reduce the uncertainty and help these families. The House has already passed dozens of bills to help grow the economy, including tax reform, limiting excessive regulations, debt reduction, and yes, reforming Obamacare. The President has repeatedly said he's willing to negotiate on all of these economic issues. As recently as October the 3rd, he stated, quote, "I'm happy to negotiate with you on anything. I don't think any one party has a monopoly on wisdom." Then on October the 8th, the President said serious negotiations could proceed around every item in the budget. He went on to say that negotiations would not be limited just to the budget. He said, "I will sit down and work with anyone of any party, not only to talk about the budget, about ways to improve the health care system, and about ways that we can shrink our long-term deficits." Congress has now upheld its end of the bargain. The American people can now judge whether the President will uphold his. In the next 90 days, let's demonstrate that Congress can indeed work in a bipartisan fashion and tackle our most serious problems now: a weak economy, a growing national debt, and a health care law that isn't ready for implementation. It's important to note the House took the steps necessary to initiate negotiations. Therefore, in fairness, the President and the Senate need to come to the table. History will record whether the President fulfills his repeated pledges and addresses these barriers to America's economic exceptionalism. Last week, many of us in the chamber extended a hand of bipartisan cooperation to the President. But as President Reagan once said, "Trust but verify." I yield back the balance of my time.
The gentleman yields back. The chair recognizes the gentlewoman from Illinois, Ms. Bustos, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I rise today to talk about an important provision that I worked hard on with a bipartisan group of Illinois senators and House members to have included in the new Water Resources Reform and Development Act. This bill, also known as WRDA, is a vital piece of legislation that Congress will consider later today. Our provision would help improve the nation's water infrastructure, including the aging locks and dams along the Mississippi and Illinois rivers, through public-private partnerships that would expedite projects and save taxpayer money. It comes from a House and Senate, Democrat and Republican, bill called the Water Infrastructure Now Public-Private Partnership Act. I was proud to introduce this bill earlier this year with Senators Durbin and Kirk and Representative Rodney Davis, all proudly of Illinois. Our provision would help clear a $60 billion backlog in the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers projects that will take decades to complete without outside investment. It does this by creating a pilot program to explore agreements between the Army Corps of Engineers and private entities as alternatives to traditional financing, planning, design, and construction models. The Mississippi and Illinois rivers are absolutely critical to the economic well-being of my region in Illinois, the entire Midwest, and the United States and the world. These locks and dams were built during the administration of Franklin Roosevelt and are now close to 80 years old. This is why action must be taken to expand and modernize the locks and dams that help transport our goods and products worldwide. By encouraging public-private partnerships, our bipartisan effort will help make the movement of the high-quality goods of our region, whether they be from any of the numerous farmers and manufacturers that call Illinois home, more swift, efficient, and safe. To put this in perspective, the Mississippi River is the world's largest inland navigable waterway. On the Mississippi River, just on this river alone, 60% So well over half of the nation's agricultural goods are transported. It is absolutely critical to American commerce and the smooth movement of goods that this is made as efficient as possible. Our bill fits perfectly into that equation. And it's good for the taxpayer, the farmer, and industry. I'm very proud of that. In addition to our efforts to improve our nation's locks and dams, the Water Resources Reform and Development Act also contains many provisions that will boost local economies across our country. The water bill will lead to upgraded water transportation systems and offer vulnerable communities better protection against flooding. It is very important to my region that I represent. It will promote America's competitiveness, prosperity, and economic growth for years to come. Mr. Speaker, I came to Congress to work with those I don't always agree with and who don't always agree with me, but as a way to find common sense, reasonable solutions to create jobs and lay the foundation for a stronger middle class. I was proud that the water bill passed out of the House Transportation Committee on a bipartisan, unanimous basis. I give credit, a great deal of credit, to Transportation Committee Chairman Bill Schuster, Ranking Member Nick Rahal, Subcommittee Chairman Bob Gibbs, and Subcommittee Ranking Member Tim Bishop, and all of my colleagues on the committee for their hard work over the last year. It is truly an example of congressional Republicans and Democrats working together, and I hope it's something that we will see a lot more of. I urge my colleagues on both sides of the aisle to support this important, job-creating bill when it comes to the floor later today. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
The gentlewoman yields back. The chair recognizes the gentleman from Alabama, Mr. Brooks, for 5 minutes.
Mr. Speaker, Benjamin Franklin once advised, when you run in debt, you give to another power over your liberty. Washington is in an epic political battle that controls America's destiny for decades to come. The fight is between those who are financially responsible and have the understanding and backbone needed to prevent an American bankruptcy and those who do not. Last week, mainstream news media pundits declared a great win for Democrats and President Obama when the federal government reopened and the debt ceiling was raised. To the contrary, and for reasons I will explain, last week was a major loss for the American people. America's economy suffers from a $17 trillion debt, the worst in history, and 5 years of deficits averaging more than $1 trillion per year, again, the worst in history. During the past 5 years, the federal government borrowed 30% of its spending. How many families and businesses can avoid bankruptcy if year after year 30% of their spending is borrowed money? Not many and not for long. Yet that is exactly what our country, America, is doing. Economic principles don't care if you are a family, a business, or a country. If you borrow more money than you can pay back, you go bankrupt. Mr. Speaker, America has been warned. President Obama's Comptroller General Dodaro warns America's finances are on an, quote, unsustainable path, end quote. Former Chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, Admiral Michael Mullen, warns that our greatest national security threat is not Iran, al-Qaeda, China, or Russia. It is our debt burden that undermines our ability to pay for America's national defense and thus risk our national security. Detroit and Stockton bankruptcies mean retirees may lose their pensions. Greece, another debtor nation, has a 27% unemployment rate, worse than any year in America's Great Depression. There are good and bad ways to fund the federal government and raise the debt ceiling. Last week, Washington chose the worst way by not fixing the underlying problem, deficits, and debt. Instead, Washington again kicked the can down the road, forcing America to revisit government funding issues in January and debt ceiling issues in February, with one major difference. America will be financially weaker and less able to face the problem because we will be burdened by another $500 billion in debt. Mr. Speaker, another $500 billion in debt. I wonder why you didn't hear that from the media pundits. Why did America get for another $500 billion in debt? Not one penny in spending cuts, not a single economic policy that creates jobs and grows our economy, nothing that fixes our deficit and debt problem. What Washington did last week is akin to a sick patient going to the emergency room and getting pain-killing drugs that help the patient feel good, yet do nothing to cure the disease that ultimately kills the patient. In the real world, that's medical malpractice. Similarly, Washington's refusal last week to cure our deficit and debt disease was governing malpractice. Mr. Speaker, America enjoys prosperity today because past generations sacrificed to make us who we are. We have the same obligation to our descendants. President George Washington once advised Congress that, quote, "No pecuniary consideration is more urgent than the regular redemption and discharge of the public debt. On none can delay be more injurious," end quote. George Washington gave prudent advice in 1793. It is prudent advice now. Washington must cut out-of-control spending and balance the budget before America's debt burden spirals out of control and is so great that we cannot recover. Failure risks a bankruptcy that will destroy the America it took our ancestors generations, centuries to build. Mr. Speaker, the fight for America resumes in January on properly funding the government and in February on properly raising the debt ceiling. Ours is a fight America must win. Congress and the White House must rise to the challenge and be financially responsible when funding the government and raising the debt ceiling. America's future as a great nation and world power depends on it. Mr. Speaker, I yield back.
The gentleman yields back. The chair recognizes the gentleman from Puerto Rico, Mr. Pierre Luisi, for 5 minutes.
Mr. Speaker, Monday marked the 10th anniversary of the passing of Luis Ferré. I rise this morning to pay tribute to this giant of a man, whom the New York Times called the dominant force in the politics, economy, and culture of Puerto Rico for much of the 20th century. In a real sense, Don Luis personified his beloved Puerto Rico, embodying both its progress and its struggles. He was born in Ponce in 1904, a few years after Puerto Rico became a U.S. territory. Was a teenager when island residents were granted American citizenship in 1917. Served as a delegate to the convention that drafted Puerto Rico's local constitution in the early 1950s. Was elected as the island's governor in 1968. Served as a member of the Puerto Rico Senate, including as its president, in the late 1970s and early 1980s, and remained engaged in public life as a revered elder statesman well beyond his formal retirement from politics. Don Luis lived to age 99, but it was the fullness of his life, not its length, that is so remarkable. Trained as an engineer at MIT and as a classical pianist at the New England Conservatory of Music, Ferré was a true Renaissance man. He loved ideas, intellectual debate, and culture, founding the renowned Ponce Museum of Art. But he was also at home in the practical world of business, taking a small company and transforming it into one of Puerto Rico's most successful conglomerates. He published a newspaper, now called El Nuevo Día, which is run by his grandchildren and has the largest circulation of any periodical on the island. Don Luis was also a committed philanthropist who took to heart the biblical axiom that to whom much is given, much is expected. In 1991, Ferré was awarded the Presidential Medal of Freedom, the nation's highest civilian honor, by President George H.W. Bush, who called Ferré a public servant of the First Order and an extraordinary leader in the life of Puerto Rico. On a personal level, Ferré refuted the notion that great men are seldom good men. Like any effective leader, he was tough when he needed to be, but he was also kind, warm, and generous, inspiring affection and loyalty as well as respect. Don Luis was a gentleman through and through. He was old school in the best sense of the term. Few, if any, Puerto Ricans have accomplished as much in their lives as Don Luis, or left behind such a lasting legacy. A proud Republican and founder of the local New Progressive Party, Ferrer did not live to see his goal of statehood for Puerto Rico realized. But he encouraged and mentored a new generation of leaders who understand that Puerto Rico's colonial status, as Don Luis called it, deprives island residents of political and civil rights, hinders their economic progress, and harms their quality of life. As I and other pro-statehood advocates work to perfect Puerto Rico's union with the U.S., we're guided by Don Luis' example and draw strength from his memory. Ferrer once described himself as revolutionary in his ideas, liberal in his objectives, and conservative in his methods. Thanks to Don Luis and others, statehood is no longer a revolutionary idea. It has become the predominant force in Puerto Rico politics, while support for the status quo continues to decline and support for separate nationhood remains slight. Last November, a clear majority of voters in Puerto Rico rejected territory status, and more voters expressed a preference for statehood than for any other status option. I wish Don Luis had been alive to witness this historic event. When Puerto Rico does become a state, as I know it will, we will look back upon Luis Ferrer's life and say that this man, as much as any other man, was responsible for this crowning achievement. Thank you.
The gentleman yields back. The chair recognizes the gentlewoman from West Virginia, Ms. CAPITO, for 5 minutes.
To address the House for 5 minutes and revising semi-remarks.
Without objection.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. October is National Breast Cancer Awareness Month, and it is estimated that almost 40,000 women in the United States will die of breast cancer this year. Those are mothers, sisters, grandmothers, wives, daughters. We'll miss them, and it shouldn't be. Thousands of men will be diagnosed with breast cancer as well. Breast cancer is the second leading cause of cancer death among women in the United States. Globally, breast cancer accounts for 1/4 of all cancer suffered by women. Every family, probably in this chamber today and across America, has been touched in their lives by somebody who's had breast cancer, and I'm certainly no exception. My mother-in-law, Ruth S.Q. CAPITO, died tragically at age 51 as diagnosed with breast cancer. I never knew her as a mother-in-law, and my children never got to enjoy the pleasures of having her as their grandmother. The emptiness and the hurt never goes away. With the efforts of many dedicated to fighting breast cancer, we are making some progress, but limited progress, in stopping premature deaths caused by this terrible disease. In 1991, an average of 119 women in the United States died of breast cancer each day. Today, more than 20 years later, an average of 108 women will die of the disease each day. So between the years of 2000 and 2009, the cancer mortality rate for women has declined by 1.9% annually. We must accelerate the progress we are making in finding new life-saving treatments for breast cancer. That is why I introduced H.R. 1830, the Accelerating the End of Breast Cancer Act, along with a bipartisan group of co-sponsors. The Accelerating the End of Breast Cancer Act sets a national goal of ending deaths from the disease by 2020. This bill would establish a commission that would direct federal and private sector resources towards the promising treatments aimed at stopping metastasis or the spread of breast cancer to other parts of the body. The legislation is not designed to spend more taxpayers' dollars. In fact, the bill does not authorize any new federal spending. Instead, it is designed to direct our existing research dollars in the most efficient way possible. The Accelerating the End of Breast Cancer Act will not duplicate the efforts of existing government agencies and programs, but will instead perform a vital check and balance and help ensure our limited research dollars are funding the most promising science in the area of breast cancer research. Working in this way and building on the decades of federal investment and achievement in breast cancer research, we can move forward to end breast cancer and learn how to prevent the disease within the next decade. So far, there are 172 House members from both parties and all ideologies have co-sponsored this legislation. I invite my colleagues today in this month of Breast Cancer Awareness Month of October who have not yet co-sponsored to join us in a co-sponsorship. And I look forward to working with members on both sides of the aisle to spur the development of new life-saving treatments for those with breast cancer. The hope to end breast cancer can become a reality. Let's join together to make that happen. I yield back.
The gentlewoman yields back. The chair recognizes the gentleman from California, Mr. Honda, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I rise to voice my concerns about provisions in the Water Resources Reform and Development Act that put communities, taxpayers, and the environment at risk by undermining the National Environmental Policy Act. NEPA reviews have been useful for identifying potentially costly problems with water projects, allowing changes to save taxpayer dollars and avoid delays. This bill contains so-called streamlining provisions based on the flawed notion that NEPA is causing project delays. But studies have shown that other factors like insufficient funding for the Corps are the cause of delays. The bill limits public participation in the decision-making process, which will deny the Corps the benefit of public and expert input. I ask the chairman to work as this bill moves forward to ensure that the bill does not degrade the NEPA process. And I also hope that the chairman will work with me to provide the Corps the authority to perform ecosystem restoration, that kind of work, on lands owned by other federal agencies, which is needed to complete important projects such as the South San Francisco Bay Salt Pond Restoration Project. I tried to offer a simple amendment to the Water Resources Reform and Development Act today, but the Rules Committee did not make any amendment in that order. Currently, the Army Corps of Engineers has the authority to use construction funds to perform flood protection work on the lands owned by other federal agencies, but the Corps does not have the legal authority to use construction funds to perform ecosystem restoration work on the lands owned by other federal agencies. In 2013, we all believe that good flood protection projects must incorporate ecosystem restoration, and the Corps has the ability to do the integrated projects like this everywhere else except on lands owned by another federal agency. This poses a significant hurdle in the case of the South Bay Salt Pond Restoration Project, which seeks to return the San Francisco Bay to its natural state and provide flood protection and wetlands restoration. In this case, the state of California and the United States government, through the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, own the land on which the project will be performed, even though most of the funding to buy the land came from the state and by non-federal interests. The Corps has told the local partners that it does not have the legal authority to perform the ecosystem restoration aspects of this work on lands owned by the Fish and Wildlife Service, and it needs Congress to provide that authority. My amendment simply sought to fix this situation by granting the Corps that authority so it could pursue this joint flood protection and ecosystem restoration project. I asked Chairman Schuster and Gibbs and Ranking Members Rahal and Bishop to work with me as this bill goes to conference with the Senate to provide the work the Corps needs with the authority it needs to carry out this and projects for which it had already been authorized to perform feasibility studies. I yield back.
The gentleman yields back. The chair recognizes the gentleman from Texas, Mr. Olson, for 5 minutes.
I thank the Speaker. My hometown of Houston, Texas, lost an icon last week, Bum Phillips. Bum coached the Houston Oilers in their heyday, 1975 through 1980. twice during that tenure, they came within one game of going to the Super Bowl. Bud was loved because he was more than a football coach. He was a true Texan who happened to be a football coach, a Houston, Texas football coach. Bum understood the rivalry between Dallas, Texas and Houston, Texas. He said, the Dallas Cowboys may be America's team, but the Houston Oilers are Texas's team. And he knew football was just a game. As he said, winning is only half of it. Having fun is the other half. And he had fun. In 1977, the Oilers drafted a star running back from Texas, Earl Campbell, the Heisman Trophy winner, University of Texas graduate, a Longhorn from Tyler, Texas. In their first practice, Earl finished dead last in the mile run of the whole team. A reporter asked Bum if he was worried about Earl. Could he perform in the NFL? Bum deadpan, when it's first in a mile, I won't give it to him. He loved his players. Nobody more so than Earl Campbell. And Bud showed his love for Earl by saying, I don't know if Earl is in a class by himself, but I do know that when that class gets together, it sure doesn't take long to call the roll. Love you, Blue. Love you, Bum. Thanks for the memories. God has a small class waiting for you in heaven. And yes, it won't take long to take the roll. God bless Bum Phillips. I yield back.
The gentleman yields back. The chair recognizes the gentleman from California, Mr. Schiff, for 5 minutes.